Imagine getting pulled over for no reason, humiliated, and then sued by the very cop who abused his power, only to reveal in court that you're a federal prosecutor. Sounds unbelievable? Think again, because that's exactly what happened when Officer Larson tried to take down the wrong man. But what started as a personal fight for justice uncovered a web of corruption far bigger than anyone expected. And trust me, you won't believe how deep this goes. But before we dive into this insane true story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. And if you're ready to see how one man took on an entire corrupt system, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think justice was truly served? Now, let's get into it. The air in the courtroom was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that pressed down on everyone present. Every breath felt measured, every glance cautious. The plaintiff's table sat rigid, Officer Greg Larson wearing a smug smirk, the kind that belonged to someone who thought he had already won. His attorney sat beside him, tapping a pen against his folder, eyes brimming with quiet confidence. And then, without rush, without hesitation, Samuel Preston rose to his feet. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. The navy suit he wore was pristine, tailored to perfection, the kind of detail that spoke of precision, a trait that went far beyond his clothing. His gaze swept across the room before finally landing on Larson, holding it there just long enough for something unsettling to settle beneath the officer's skin. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the anticipation growing as Samuel finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. Before we proceed, Your Honor, I believe it's only fair I disclose my professional background. Larson scoffed, leaning back in his chair, amusement flickering in his eyes. He nudged his attorney with his elbow, exchanging a knowing glance. A delay tactic, he must have thought, a desperate attempt to shift the narrative. The judge, intrigued but composed, adjusted her glasses. Go on, Mr. Preston. Samuel let the silence hang for just a second longer than necessary, letting the weight of the moment settle before delivering the blow. I am not merely a defendant in this case, he said smoothly, his words carefully chosen. He paused, just long enough to let the curiosity in the room peak. Then, with the same measured tone, he continued. My name is Samuel Preston. His voice never wavered, never broke. And I serve as a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. The courtroom erupted. Gasps shot through the crowd like an unexpected crack of thunder. Conversations broke out in hushed, urgent whispers, people shifting in their seats as if they had just been jolted awake. Larson's smirk vanished. His back stiffened, his hands clenched instinctively around the edges of the table. His once relaxed confidence shattered like glass, giving way to something colder, something dangerously close to panic. His attorney paled, his grip tightening around the pen in his fingers as realization dawned on him, slow and heavy. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable, but the sharpness in her eyes revealed that she understood exactly what had just happened. Mr. Preston, she said carefully, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Are you telling this court that the lawsuit was filed against you without the plaintiff knowing who you were? Silence. Samuel's lips curled into a faint smile, not arrogant, not boastful. It was the kind of smile that knew something others didn't, the kind that warned the game had already changed. That would appear to be the case, Your Honor. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick, unmovable. Larson's hands, still gripping the table, began to tremble ever so slightly. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, his breathing just a little too shallow. He swallowed hard, but it did nothing to rid the tightness in his throat. Samuel, however, remained still, composed, unbothered, because he already knew this wasn't just a case anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The heat clung to the streets of downtown Chicago, thick and suffocating, the kind of summer evening where the air itself felt heavy. The city hummed around him, distant laughter from an open-air bar, the rhythmic bass of a passing car's stereo, the occasional honk of impatient drivers weaving through late-night traffic. Samuel Preston had just finished dinner with a few old friends, the kind of evening that left him feeling lighter, even if just for a moment. He loosened the top button of his shirt, rolling his sleeves up as he made his way toward his car, a sleek, spotless Tesla parked just a few feet away, and then flashing red and blue lights. A voice cut through the thick summer air, sharp and commanding. "Hey, you!" Samuel stopped mid-step, his muscles tensing instinctively. The voice wasn't a casual inquiry, it was an accusation, wrapped in authority. He turned slowly, his hands already visible. Officer Greg Larson stood just a few yards away, his hand resting lightly, but deliberately, on the grip of his holstered gun. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Samuel like he was something to be sized up, categorized, and dismissed. "We've had reports of a black male breaking into cars in this area," Larson said, his voice edged with the kind of certainty that left no room for explanation. "You match the description." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his face remained unreadable. His gaze flickered to his car, pristine, untouched, parked right where he left it. He gestured toward it with a measured calm. "This is my vehicle," he said, reaching into his pocket, moving slow, controlled, before pulling out his wallet. "I can show you my ID and registration." Larson didn't even glance at it. "Hands on the car." The words were clipped, final, non-negotiable. For a brief moment, Samuel considered pushing back, demanding to know why, demanding to be treated with the same respect any other man might have been given. But he knew better. So, he complied. The metal of the Tesla was warm beneath his fingertips as he placed his hands against it. The air barely stirred as Larson frisked him roughly, shoving his hands into pockets, patting him down with a force that wasn't necessary, but was deliberate. Samuel exhaled slowly, feeling the frustration coil in his gut like a tightening rope. The second officer, silent, standing a few feet away, watched, said nothing. After a few beats, Larson pulled Samuel's wallet from his pocket, flipping it open. His expression remained unreadable as he scanned the ID, the badge name still pinned to his uniform. G. Larson. "You're clean," he muttered, his tone edged with what almost sounded like disappointment. But instead of handing the wallet back and letting the moment pass, he ripped off a citation and slapped it into Samuel's palm. "Consider this a warning," Larson said, his voice casual, like he was doing him a favor. Samuel stared at the piece of paper in his hand, feeling the weight of something far heavier settle in his chest. A warning for what, exactly? Existing? Being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Driving a car that didn't fit the narrative in Larson's head? He let his fingers tighten around the citation, knuckles whitening, before finally glancing back up at the officer. His gaze wasn't angered, just knowing, just certain. Greg Larson. Samuel committed the name to memory, engraving it deep into the back of his mind like a brand. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was a message. And Samuel Preston wasn't the kind of man who ignored messages. A single week had passed. Samuel Preston hadn't forgotten. He hadn't forgotten the way Officer Larson had sized him up, hadn't forgotten the unnecessary roughness, the condescending smirk, the so-called warning that reeked of something much deeper than a routine stop. He had tucked that moment away, not out of anger, but out of calculation. Then, the lawsuit arrived, a crisp envelope, official letterhead. The claim? Harassment. Samuel almost laughed. Larson was accusing him of intimidation. The irony wasn't lost on him. But he didn't react, didn't call his attorney in a frenzy, didn't rush to clear his name. Instead, he got to work. He started with the body cam footage. Pulling it wasn't difficult. He had connections, and as soon as he obtained the files, he played them back in silence, watching, listening. Every second, every word, every gesture from that night replayed on the screen in painful clarity. Then, he dug deeper. Larson's record. The further he went, the more disturbing the pattern became. One report after another, all too similar. Baseless stops, fabricated accusations, a pattern of racial profiling that stretched back years. Some complaints had mysteriously disappeared before they reached internal affairs. The few that did stick led to nothing. No reprimands, no investigations, just silence. And then, the names. Men like Andre Williams. Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring at the file in front of him. Andre, a promising college student, had been pulled over by Larson the previous year. The accusation? Resisting arrest. There was no evidence, no witnesses, just Larson's word against Andre's. And that had been enough to destroy the young man's future. He lost his scholarship. He lost his job. He lost everything. Samuel closed the folder, pressing his fingertips together. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about one unjust stop, one false accusation, one lawsuit meant to silence him. Larson had been doing this for years, and for years the system had protected him. Samuel could walk away. He knew that. He could settle the lawsuit, sign a few papers, keep his record clean, and move on with his life. But that wasn't who he was. His grip tightened around the file. Larson wanted a fight. Fine. Samuel was ready to give him one. The courtroom was packed, but the air felt thin, suffocating in its own way. The kind of quiet that wasn't just silence, it was anticipation. Larson sat at the plaintiff's table, but he wasn't lounging back like he had before. The confidence, the arrogance, was cracking. His fingers tapped absently against the polished wood, his eyes darting toward Samuel, then away, like a man searching for an exit. Samuel, however, was still, unbothered, watching. This wasn't just a trial. It was a game, and Larson was already losing. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison. Samuel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, not on him, but on Larson. He could see it in the way the officer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, in the way his attorney stiffened slightly, as if already bracing for impact. The moment Samuel had revealed his identity, everything had changed. Larson had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win, a simple case against a man he assumed had no real power. But now he was up against a federal prosecutor, and the realization had hit him like a freight train. Your Honor, Larson's attorney cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. The plaintiff would like to request a brief recess before we proceed. A murmur rippled through the gallery. It was too soon to ask for a break. The judge narrowed her eyes, studying Larson's lawyer for a long, unreadable moment. She wasn't stupid. She knew what this was. Request granted, she finally said, banging the gavel. Court will resume in 30 minutes. Samuel smirked slightly, watching as Larson bolted from his seat. Behind closed doors, the panic exploded. The second they entered the private conference room, Larson's attorney turned on him, voice a sharp hiss. Why didn't you tell me he was a federal prosecutor? Larson's face was pale, sweat forming at his brow. He looked rattled, trapped. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw tightening as if the right answer could change reality. How the hell was I supposed to know? Larson snapped. He looked like just another punk with a fancy car. His lawyer exhaled slowly, shaking his head. We need to regroup. This isn't just about winning the case anymore. If this goes sideways, it could cost you your badge. Larson's scowl deepened, his hands pressing against the table as he leaned in. He's not going to win. He's just trying to scare us. But his lawyer didn't look convinced. Meanwhile, outside, Samuel sat calmly at the defense table, swirling the water in his glass before taking a slow sip. His attorney, Michelle Carter, leaned over, voice barely above a whisper. You think they'll back out? Samuel didn't take his eyes off the plaintiff's table. Larson's ego won't let him, he murmured. He set his glass down, watching the empty seat where Larson had been. A ghost of a smirk played at his lips. That'll be his downfall. Samuel had seen too many cases like this before. Too many names buried beneath headlines that never made it past the local news cycle. Too many lives shattered by men like Larson, protected, untouchable, unchecked. But Andre Williams' case? That one hit different. A promising college student with a bright future, Andre had everything lined up, a full-ride scholarship, a part-time job, a family that believed in him. Until one night, when he crossed paths with Greg Larson. The charge? Resisting arrest. The reality? A baseless accusation. Andre had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Larson had needed a conviction. The case was weak. No evidence, no witnesses, just Larson's word against Andre's. And that had been enough. Samuel sat in a small, dimly lit living room, the air heavy with something unspoken. Across from him, Andre's mother clutched the edges of her sweater, her knuckles white. He lost everything, she said quietly. His scholarship, his job, his confidence. Her voice trembled on that last word. He used to talk about law school, you know? Said he wanted to help people, fix things. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Now, he won't even leave the house. Samuel leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. He knew this story. He'd seen it play out 100 times before. And this was why he couldn't just walk away. Back in court, Larson was unraveling. He had walked in with arrogance. But now, he was floundering. Michelle Carter stood at the center of the courtroom, her sharp gaze locked onto the officer in the witness stand. Officer Larson, she said, voice smooth but edged with steel. You testified that Mr. Preston made threatening remarks toward you. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Can you recall his exact words? Larson shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders back. He said that I'd regret this. Michelle raised an eyebrow. And did he elaborate on how exactly he intended to make you regret it? Larson hesitated. The silence stretched. No, he finally muttered, voice barely above a whisper. So you're basing your entire claim of intimidation on a vague statement. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Michelle let the silence settle, let them feel it. Then she moved in for the kill. Officer Larson, she continued, pacing now, her words deliberate, cutting. You also claimed that Mr. Preston used his position as a federal prosecutor to intimidate you. She turned, fixing her gaze on him. Can you provide any evidence to support this claim? Emails? Phone calls? Witnesses? Larson's jaw tightened. He shook his head. No. A single damning word. Michelle turned to the jury. No further questions. As she walked back to the defense table, she passed Samuel, her lips curling into the faintest smirk. The jury had seen it. They had seen the cracks, the hesitations, the sheer lack of credibility. Larson had built his case on lies. And now, it was falling apart. The tension in the courtroom was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Everyone could feel it, the weight of something about to break. Larson sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, His fingers curled so tightly around the armrests that his knuckles turned white. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but the damage had already begun. Michelle Carter stepped forward, her expression composed, almost too calm. A predator before the final strike. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "with your permission, I'd like to introduce new evidence into the record." Samuel sat back, watching as the courtroom stilled. The judge gave a curt nod. "Proceed." Michelle didn't hesitate. She turned toward the large monitor positioned in the center of the room, where the unedited body cam footage had just been queued up. She lifted the remote, pressing play. The room fell silent. The screen flickered to life, grainy at first, but then, Larson's voice. "Another one of you people thinking you're above the law." The words were sharp, dripping with contempt. "You're lucky I don't drag you in for just existing." A ripple of shock surged through the gallery. Gasps. A few muffled curses. Even the jury, who had been carefully neutral up until now, shifted in their seats. The camera's perspective was clear. Larson stood tall, chest puffed out, face twisted in a sneer. Samuel, by contrast, was composed, his voice calm, controlled. He had asked why he was being stopped, but Larson hadn't answered. He hadn't needed to. The footage continued, playing out in excruciating detail. Larson's rough frisking. The way he ignored the ID Samuel had tried to show him. The mocking tone in his voice as he handed over the citation. And when the clip ended? Silence. The judge's jaw was tight, her expression unreadable. But the way she slowly removed her glasses, exhaling through her nose, told everyone exactly what she was thinking. Larson's attorney had gone completely pale. He cleared his throat, shifting in his chair, opening his mouth as if he wanted to object. But what could he say? This wasn't hearsay. It wasn't interpretation. It was Larson's own voice, his own actions, laid bare for the world to see. Michelle let the silence stretch for just a few more seconds before turning to the jury. She smiled then, slow and deliberate, before speaking. "I'll let you decide," she said, her voice dripping with a controlled confidence. "Who the real victim is here." The body cam footage had shattered whatever illusion of credibility Larson had left. The courtroom still buzzed with the echoes of what they had just witnessed, murmurs rippling through the gallery like aftershocks from an earthquake. The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions no longer neutral. At the plaintiff's table, Larson's attorney sat rigid, his face a shade lighter than before, as if he were already mourning a case he knew was slipping through his fingers. His jaw tensed, and then, with a slow inhale, he leaned toward Larson, lowering his voice. "We need to cut a deal." Larson stiffened. "We're done," the attorney muttered, urgency creeping into his tone. "If this goes to a verdict, you're not just going to lose, you're going to bury yourself. We negotiate now, or you're walking out of here with nothing but a badge that's about to be ripped off your chest." Larson's grip tightened against the table, his knuckles going white. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The rage boiled under his skin, thick and seething. This was supposed to be easy. Another man to put in his place, another name to bury under legal paperwork. He pushed back from the table sharply, ignoring his attorney's warning glare. Outside the courtroom, in the dimly lit hallway, he found him. Samuel Preston stood near the water cooler, flipping through a file, calm, collected, untouched by the chaos that had consumed Larson. And that? That only made the fury inside Larson burn hotter. He stalked toward Samuel, his voice a low sneer. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Samuel didn't even look up right away. He turned the page in his file, flipping it with a measured slowness that felt deliberate. Only then did he lift his gaze, meeting Larson's eyes with something cold, something unmoved. "You should have done your homework, Officer Larson." The words were quiet, final. Larson's nostrils flared, his fists clenching at his sides. There was more he wanted to say, wanted to scream, but something in Samuel's tone stopped him short. Because for the first time, Larson wasn't in control. He turned sharply, storming down the hall, his attorney trailing after him, muttering something about keeping his emotions in check. But Samuel knew. Larson wasn't done yet. That night, alone in his apartment, Samuel sat at his desk, reviewing files, highlighting patterns. His instincts told him there was more to this, that Larson wasn't just some rogue cop with a vendetta. There was a bigger force at play. His phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. You think you've won? You've only scratched the surface. Samuel read it once, then again. He exhaled slowly, setting his phone face down on the table. He had been right. Larson was just a pawn. And now, he needed to find out who was really pulling the strings. Larson had vanished. No reports filed, no shifts logged, no public statements. It was as if he had been erased overnight. Samuel knew better. Men like Larson don't disappear, they hide. And when they hide, it's because they know something is coming. Then, the tip came in. A contact, one of Samuel's quiet allies within the department, left him a single voicemail. The message was cryptic, but clear. Factory on the south side, midnight. Larson's meeting someone big. If you're gonna move, move now. Samuel didn't hesitate. He called Michelle, then Carter. Within minutes, an operation was in motion. This wasn't just about Larson anymore. This was about who had been protecting him. The factory was an abandoned skeleton of rusted steel and shattered glass, the kind of place where bad deals happened in the dark. From his vantage point behind a stack of crates, Samuel could see the entrance. 2 black SUVs parked outside, engines still warm. Michelle crouched beside him, whispering, "We catch them in the act. It's over." Carter's team was already in position. Federal agents, tactical gear, weapons ready. They weren't kicking down the doors just yet. They needed to hear what was being said first. Inside, Larson was sweating. He stood in the center of the dimly lit space, pacing, frustration twisting his face. 2 men towered over him, both high-ranking officers, both men Samuel recognized from cases that had mysteriously disappeared. Larson's voice cracked with desperation. "I did everything you asked!" One of the officers, burly, sharp jaw, dead eyes, took a slow step forward. "And yet, Preston exposed you. You failed." Larson's fists clenched. His breath came quick. He was losing control. "I didn't know who he was. I can fix this." The second officer, wiry, cold, barely blinked. "There is no fixing this." Larson's voice dropped lower, desperate now. "If I go down, I'm taking you all with me." The burly officer smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't amusement, but a warning. "Be very careful, Greg. You're not as untouchable as you think." The air inside the factory shifted. Larson realized, a second too late, that he had just made a mistake. The wiry officer's hand moved toward his waistband. Samuel gave the signal. FBI SWAT swarmed the room. Shouts filled the air. Flashlights cut through the darkness. "FBI, hands in the air!" Larson barely had time to turn before he was tackled to the ground. The 2 officers didn't move at first, their expressions eerily calm, as if they had expected this. As their hands were pulled behind their backs, the burly officer exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. He turned his head just enough to look at Samuel. "This isn't over." Samuel met his gaze, unfazed. "No," he murmured. "It's just getting started." Larson sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked smaller now. The arrogance, the bravado, it was all gone. What sat in front of Samuel now wasn't a predator. It was a man who knew he was prey. Carter stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching in silence. Michelle leaned against the wall, waiting. But it was Samuel who sat directly across from Larson, fingers steepled, gaze steady. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Larson exhaled shakily. "You think this is over?" His voice was hoarse, like a man who had been running out of air for too long. Samuel didn't respond. He just waited. Larson cracked. "You don't get it." His eyes darted between them, searching for some sign that they understood, that they knew what they had walked into. Sinclair was never the real problem. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. There's someone else, someone above all of this. Michelle pushed off the wall, her tone sharp. "Who?" Larson hesitated. "They call him the benefactor." Even Carter's expression changed at that. Samuel leaned forward, his voice calm but lethal. "Who is he?" Larson shook his head quickly, his knee bouncing under the table. "I don't know. Nobody does. That's the point. You don't see him, you don't hear from him. But he's the one pulling the strings, the one keeping people like Sinclair in power. He owns judges, politicians, hell, probably people inside the bureau." His breath hitched. "He's the reason I could do what I did for so long." His voice dropped lower, like he wasn't just confessing, he was begging. "You don't want to go after them. They're untouchable." Silence. Then Samuel locked eyes with him. "No one is untouchable." Larson swallowed again, but he said nothing, because he saw it in Samuel's face. He had just declared war. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the moment. Carter turned and stepped out. When he returned, his face was unreadable as he slid Samuel's phone across the table. Samuel picked it up. A new message. Unknown number. "You've crossed the line. Walk away while you still can." The screen glowed in the dim light, but Samuel didn't flinch, didn't react. He just turned the phone over, setting it down gently. He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. If you want to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment below. Who do you think the benefactor really is? The fight isn't over yet, so stay tuned.